Here. Good morning. My name is Anthony Amboy. I oversee Student Equity and Achievement and Guided Pathways program under Dean Michael Kiawit. Welcome to the Student Equity Plan 2022 to 2025 webinar. Before we get started with our presentations, I wanted to kind of just go into some introductions and also provide you with some general information about this webinar in particular. Next slide, please. So, no, go back one more, go back one. So again, welcome. I will say it again, I'm Anthony Amboy. I oversee Student Equity Achievement and Guided Pathways. And one of the key things that I wanted to mention and I wanted to say is thank you so much for taking the time out of your schedules, for being here. We know that many colleges are in transition or either working to transition to be in person, and that's a chaotic time, or you're still and we're all still navigating through this pandemic. And so thank you so much for taking the time and energy and effort to be here to learn more about the Student Equity Plan and the changes that are coming. In relation to that, we need to recognize that the work that you've been doing throughout this entire time, especially for this past Student Equity Plan cycle, has been very difficult. It's work that is necessary. It's work that we have seen to be student-centered and student-driven. And many of you here have been, and many of your colleagues that are not here today have been working tirelessly to make student equity and the process of building better equity on your campuses a priority, an imperative, and also connected to many of the programs and services that your colleges provide. And we're thankful that you've been putting this energy and effort in, and we want to recognize that effort and the difficulty of that effort. In relation to that, so many things are related to the vision for success and the call to action. In how we've navigated through this pandemic and the way that we've created institutional changes on our campus, the way that we've taken risks on our campuses. And one of the things that we're working to do is, especially thinking about SEED program and guided pathways and compliance and that process, is to really encourage those risk-taking processes and really looking at data to make the race-conscious changes that you need to on your campus. We really can see that, especially through some of the things that we've done over the past year, that colleges are trying very hard to work together to develop equitable changes, to learn about new processes, and also to see what's out there at other campuses to bring to their campus to make whatever you're doing better, right? And so with that process, we really want to say that from looking at guided pathways to looking at student equity and achievement, as our goals continue to be reducing friction points for students, and our goals continue to be thinking about this process of continually improving, really guiding inquiry and really trying to make changes and trying to figure out which ways we can make changes on our campuses. We wanted our student equity plan to reflect that effort, to reflect that energy, and to also not just be a tool that sits after it's completed, right? We wanted it to be a tool that could be used to continue the process over this 3-year span of improving equity on our campuses. And really thinking about how we can be more race conscious in our decisions to uplift all of our students while making sure that the things that we do don't leave other students behind and other students groups experiencing disproportionate impact. And so we hope that you can see the input of the stakeholders in our continuous improvement as we walk through the design and development of this new student equity plan. We've been working tirelessly to really build this plan in a manner that considers the energy, the effort, and the thoughts of many partners that work both in the classroom and in student services and beyond that. And we hope that you can see that today. Next slide, please. So with that being said, there's a couple housekeeping things. If you need to, if you'd like to use closed captioning, it is available. And that's within the Zoom user interface. We have a question and answer option available. So if you have a question that you'd like to be answered by some of our presenters today, please ask the question and answer. We also have general chat. And for those of you that are just joining us, please tell us where you are watching our webinar from. We really appreciate having you here. And again, I want to be respectful of all of your time. Thank you so much for being here. Next slide, please. And with that being said, these are our presenters for today. I've taken the role of Dean Kiawit, and so we are going to be continuing forward by going into this process of the Student Equity Plan, what we've done to transform it, and to really thinking about that process of creating more student-centered campus cultures across our entire system. And with that being said, next slide, please. Here is our agenda for today. Right, we're going to do, after I'm finished, we're going to go over the background behind the design of the plan. We will be providing a tutorial of the plan, and also thinking about the process of data with the plan. We wanted to make sure that we've provided you with the right place to be able to see what data is going to be available, how we're going to navigate through the process of navigating through that data, and also what's available for you as we move forward with this plan and working towards submission in November. With that being said, we will be moving into the background portion. It is my pleasure to introduce Drs. Laura Brady and Dr. Ramirez. So next slide, please. Doctors, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Anthony. If we can advance to the next slide, please. Good morning, everybody. My name is Ray Ramirez. My pronouns are he, him, his. I am the Director of Student Equity and Success at Fresno City College. I'm so happy to be here in the space with all of you, and likewise, thank you for being with us. A couple things we want to share with you in setting up the context in the design of the Student Equity Plan 2.0 is hopefully foundational for the rest of the information you're going to receive today from the colleagues on this webinar and panel. It's important to note that we've assigned some nomenclature that maybe hasn't been unpacked through email communications or other mediums, and that's the SEP, right? The Student Equity Plan 2.0. Hence, there's a 1.0, right? So we're referring to this as the new era, if you will, of the Student Equity Plan, the 2.0. Which is affirming that the previous equity plan, the 1.0, which includes the 2018-2021 plan, but even before that, right, since 2014-15, when colleges in the state received the HEPI funds from the system for their equity planning efforts, right? And so during those years, it's important for us to affirm that as a work group in coming up with the design for this new equity plan template, we fully acknowledge that the national, statewide, and geographically speaking within the state, right, there are contexts in which things were different then than they are now. Specifically, what I'm referring to is the, by and large, race evasion and race neutrality of the planning efforts that went into the Student Equity Plan 1.0 compared to what you will see in the new Student Equity Plan template, the SEP 2.0. The national landscape then certainly was different. And when you think about the national landscape now, we're really encouraging you to think about the multi-pandemic, which refers to, of course, the health pandemic, right, related to COVID-19. Importantly, we're also mindful and affirmative of the fact that there is an ensuing racial injustices, right, that are happening throughout the nation, throughout our state. And a consequence of that has been a call to action, right, among many bodies across the state. There have been resolutions and call to actions from the Chancellor's Office, the statewide academic senate, classified senates, your local student governments on your campuses, and certainly statewide. And these are among a few examples of bodies who are asking for accountability with regard to racism and the racial reckoning, as it's described, that garnered much attention after the public murder of Mr. Floyd, right? And so we're fully aware that there were national, statewide, and local contexts that had an influence on the previous equity plan template, and therefore our implementation efforts, right? Oppositely, we're hoping that with this new plan, that the intentionality that we put into the plan in terms of it being race conscious in a critically affirmative manner leads to better opportunities to create equity in experiences and outcomes for our racial minoritized and marginalized students. Likewise, something I'm very proud of with this new template, the Student Equity Plan 2.0 template, is the level of collaboration that has went into the design of this template. So with the Student Equity Plan 1.0 template, the previous cycle, right, by and large, the design of that template was spearheaded out of the Chancellor's office, right? So the colleagues at the Chancellor's office, comparatively with this new template, the Chancellor's office has been very intentional and reaching out to colleagues from the field, expert scholars who are experts in the field of equity and community colleges. And then we also have other consultants who are enhancing our efforts in designing a template that we hope is the best template to date for all of you. In similar ways, what we're hoping that you see in this new template is that it creates opportunities of thinking and reflection in the colleges that encourage you to think about collaborating with various colleagues, constituency groups, bodies, and especially the students, right? Centering the students in the student equity plan process. And so the collaboration piece has been very intentional, both with the design of the 2.0 template and also some of the questions and prompts that we are including in the new template. Hopefully leads to better cross collaboration, cross-functionally in your colleges and even in your districts. Think about the multi-college districts, right? What are ways in which you can collaborate within colleges and within multi-college districts, other colleges, right? And with that, I'll turn it over to my colleague, Dr. Laura Brady, who's going to talk about some of the new iterations.
Thank you, Dr. Ramirez, for providing some of the context for the new plan. Good morning, everyone. My name is Dr. Lara Brady, and I'm one of the Guided Pathways Regional Coordinators supporting the Foundation for California Community Colleges in the San Francisco Bay Area region. In thinking about the new iteration of the Student Equity Plan, one of the goals that the committee had in mind was to increase communication, have people engage in more conversations and collaborations, just to better integrate equity work of the student equity teams into larger work and projects and different areas at the college. Effectively institutionalizing the equity work, particularly pilot programs that were really popular a few years ago, and injecting effective practices throughout every single college processes to create a larger impact on student achievement. Following this up with centering the work on students and continually asking, how does their processes impact student achievement? Going from everything from how is the recruitment process structured to support the most impacted students to how can students be automatically enrolled into the graduation process? Examining what's our impact on student achievement and listening to what students are sharing is going to be critical. Another key intention was to have college teams see this plan as an opportunity to transform institutions in new ways, particularly since COVID. Specifically examining new ways to connect the plethora of services already being offered at college campuses to support the recruitment, retention, and success of students. The committee strongly believes that the new student equity plan has the potential to transform institutional cultures, structures, and practices to be more intentional and responsive to California's urgent need for highly educated racialized minority groups, in particular Black, Latinx, and Native Americans. Lastly, and before we jump on the next slide, build additional cohesion by aligning this work to the 6 Vision for Success goals, the North Star in our system, the call to action from Chancellor Oakley, as well as building on the work that partners in college have been heavily focusing on. This alignment is to make sure that the student equity plan can act as a lever to interrogate the wide underpinnings that contribute to racial inequality in degree attainment and transfer, and develop strategies that will create community colleges into high equity performing institutions. Attaining these goals will require the courage to make racial equity the guiding principle in all aspects of college work. If you could go to the next slide, please. Thank you. With these goals in mind, some of the big changes that practitioners in the field can expect to see in the new student equity plan mirror what the Chancellor's office has been modeling: a move away from transactional, some task-oriented approach, and into a transformational opportunity where the focus is on creating a vision that keeps students' achievement at the center, particularly for BIPOC groups. Another change is the intentionality behind creating a plan that becomes a roadmap for any institution on building accountability and transparency, and one that is based on community input with the ability to offer a reflective space for the institution. And before I turn it over to my colleague, Dr. Ramirez, and building on previous points, the committee was intentional in building an equity plan that could be revised throughout the year as a way to support local accountability and transparency. We wanted college teams to set high goals and track their progress continually, particularly as it relates to racialized minoritized groups, and in a dynamic way that involves the input from all campus groups, including students. Dr. Ramirez?
Thank you very much, Dr. Lara Brady. What you can also expect in this new template, as previously mentioned and highlighted, is a shift from race neutrality and what some colleagues will call race evasion to race consciousness. So the intentionality and the affirmation of acknowledging the past context of the Student Equity Plan 1.0 compared to our current realities and the ensuing calls for action, right, among various bodies and groups in the state, right? It's not only an opportunity for us to improve our efforts, right, with regards to racial equity in our campuses, but it's also an affirmation, right? And we're conveying to the system, to colleagues, to constituency groups, and most importantly, our students, that they indeed matter. We hear you. And as such, we are going to do our best to be race conscious with this template. And so that's only something you can expect in some of the prompts and some of the questions of the new template. Related to that, the previous template was by and large a standalone document, right? And so it was procedural. It might have felt like it was a check the box process, and then you had to report to the state, send the document off, and then post your executive summary publicly to your college website, right? So some of those things are still required, granted, right? But the change that you will see now is with this new template is we're encouraging colleagues from the field to think about how does the new student equity plan inform other institutional level planning documents. An example of that includes your mission statements, your vision, your core values, and therefore your strategic plans, right? The strategic plan, namely including other documents, inform what colleges do, right? So let's imagine, if you will, and seize the opportunity to use the student equity plan as an opportunity to equitize other institutional planning documents. Indeed, this has been the case at Fresno City College, where recently we just approved through our local college and board of trustees a new strategic plan, which includes equity-minded principles according to Vincent and colleagues, and principles of anti-racism that are centered in our mission, vision, and core values. This is in part due to our equity planning efforts, not with the 2.0 version, but indeed the 1.0 in our approach to being race conscious with the equity plan was an influential factor. And so in similar ways, we hope that this template leads to similar outcomes throughout the state, because locally we can impact our equity efforts, but collectively in the system, we can truly transform the lives in the state of California. Finally, with the previous template, funding was compartmentalized, right? And so what we mean by that is you by and large focused on your student equity and achievement program dollars to inform the activities and the projects that you included in your student equity plan, right? Whereas with the new template, we're really encouraging you to think about ways you can augment the dependency of categorical funding, namely the student equity and achievement program dollars, to enhance your equity planning efforts and realize better opportunities to achieve racial equity. So I know that this is a larger conversation, and based on past webinars, there appears to be an increasing amount of interest in perhaps a future webinar specifically on what braided funding can look like, or what Dr. Lara Brady and I have referred to as the trenza approach to funding equity activities and practices in our community colleges. And I'm curious to see if there's more interest from the colleagues that joined us today, and that'll probably inform subsequent webinars. And with that, now I have the honor of turning over the next section of our webinar to Sabrina. Sabrina, the floor is yours, and take it away.
Thank you, Dr. Ray Ramirez. And so just to build on what Dr. Ramirez and Dr. Laura Brady shared, when it came to the data we were reviewing, we were very committed in not shying away from addressing our college's racial disparities that persisted. And so a lot of our discussions as a work group had an intentional focus on not allowing our equity work to be race neutral. And so our approach in using the data was informed by this commitment that we must take action and responsibilities in a more direct way for those inequities experienced by our racially minoritized student populations at our college. And so what does that mean? So as a student equity work group, our conversations focused on how the disaggregated data would support the alignment of our equity work with guided pathways framework and the vision for success goals. So let's draw upon this connection that we see. So in the student equity plan metric, let's use, for example, completion of math and English. It has a connection to guided pathways, as we know. The Community College Research Center study shares that students who complete transfer level math or English in their first year are more likely to complete. We call this momentum the gateway momentum. And so using a racial equity lens to this framework allows us to identify who is experiencing disproportionate impact by the college at this momentum point and begin determining what must happen to achieve equity for those most impacted. Because when we do that, we make it possible to then achieve inclusive success for all of our students. Secondarily, we wanted the data to raise awareness. Awareness is synonymous with knowledge you now know as a college, and that the data help the college prioritize their actions that serve students experiencing the most disproportionate impact. So while not required, I do want to pause here and call out that these data are required in a sense in terms of the student equity plan about prioritizing or focusing on your students experiencing the most disproportionate impact, but I want to share why that's important. So when we see these data, they call out and provide the colleges with information and most importantly, direction of where we ought to focus by centering our students who are experiencing the most disproportionate impact by our college's practices, our policies, and culture. This level of prioritizing does signal to the college where our most critical work lies, and that undoubtedly, when you look across the system, it lies with how we respond to the call to action to serve, support, and provide educational opportunities to our Black and Brown students. And so taking the time to look at your college's equity data and framing it in a way that allows you to understand students experiencing the most disproportionate impact should actually empower you and support your college's commitment to take action and responsibilities in creating these conditions for students to achieve equitable success. And my last point is that we, as a work group, we agreed and really felt strongly that the data should be accessible for all colleges and that there should be the support of a data dashboard identifying disproportionate impact groups. And I'm not going to talk about that here because we have our partners with WestEd who are going to go in more detail about that, as well as data on demand files for you to work with locally, or even use your local data to strengthen your ongoing capacity building efforts. So I won't go, like I said, I won't go into too much detail other than sharing that there is an effort by both the Chancellor's Office and WestEd, the organization supporting the DI dashboard development, to have the data be accessible and responsive to the college questions concerning both the data and the template. And so with that, we recognize colleges will have different needs in terms of support in completing their student equity plan. And later in this presentation, you'll hear more about upcoming data webinars as well as student equity plan monthly office hours to support this effort. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Dr. Eric Felix.
Sounds good, sounds good. Buenos dias, how we doing, y'all? About 30 minutes into the presentation. Good morning, my name is Eric Felix. I lead the Chalice Research Collective at SDSU. If y'all can advance the slide, please. My remarks build off of my research and my practice working in and with community colleges to advance racial justice through the Student Equity and Achievement Program, its planning process, and as Ray has mentioned, the available funds. What I say today is nothing new. It's what Drs. Estela Mata-Ben-Simon and my colleagues Megan Chase at the Center for Urban Education have talked about over the last several years. In thinking about my remarks today, and this being the third session, I really sat back around the ways that we are only a few months away from the 30-year anniversary of the student equity policy being introduced. And if you could advance to the next slide. So if it was July 9th and 10th, for you history buffs that Gus Guichard brought this policy to the Board of Governors to think about the ways that there could be intentional discussion, inquiry, and action that thought about how do we address the racial disparities that our students experience in access, completion, and equity. At the time in the 1990s, right, the conversation is how do we avoid a permanent underclass of minorities? And of course, we wouldn't use that language today, but there was this active focus in thinking about how do we support students of color? How do we support BIPOC individuals, and thinking about that they have particular experiences, backgrounds that shape the ways that they experience higher education. And with this slide in particular, my life's work has been around thinking about how do we tap into the racial possibilities of student equity and achievement, knowing that in July of 1992, that was the explicit conversation, that it was about supporting, addressing, and making community colleges a better environment for racially minoritized students, for women, and those with disabilities. And a lot of this work comes from there, right? And I think one of the things that I've experienced over the last 8 years in my research is that, of course, but all students matter, right? Like, how do we focus on racially minoritized students when we need to focus on all students, especially in the context of California and Prop 209? I think for me, it's one of those things where we don't ignore the context of what our students experience, right? When we think about, and the work that I've done in community college, we build intentional programs for those that are returning or military connected, right? We create programs for those that have experience with foster care, but we tend to be reluctant or shy away around creating programs that can support culturally and racially diverse students. And so part of this work in the Student Equity Plan 2.0 is thinking about how do we center our racially minoritized students, right? In order to achieve the goals of Vision for Success, in particular, reducing equity gaps across all of the measures and all of the goals, the only way we're ever going to get to that success is by being laser-like and determined in our focus on addressing racial disparities. And also that's a good reminder that, you know, this is the first 5 years of the Vision for Success, and that this work will also set the tone for how we move forward in trying to address racial inequity that is experienced in community colleges. I think beyond that is that my colleagues have mentioned that you have the opportunity, you have the window, you have the environment to be race conscious, right? To be able to design, to have conversations, to develop professional development that is explicit in the ways that it addresses the experiences for racially minoritized students, that it's affirming in their background and their lived experience and their identity and their culture, and that it's asset-based, right? That the institution recognizes responsibility and accountability for the action that will be required over the next 3 years. And I don't know about y'all, but we've been living in this pandemic for the last 2.5 years. Dr. Ramirez mentioned that there's a hypervisibility around structural racism and the differentiated outcomes that our students of color experience. I believe now more than ever that it's important for us to be caring, to be intentional, to be grounded leaders that recognize the need for collective action, where we move towards our aspirations and our dreams of what can be, right? Many of you are here today, over 200, to talk about the new equity plan, the process, the template, the data, the funding, and the ways that we tie in all of the reforms that many of you have talked about already, guided pathways, strong workforce, to think about what this campus and what this community could look like in ways that achieve racial equity. And the last slide, please. Sweet. Part of my research has been to think about the ways that we use the student equity policy and its planning process to advance racial justice. This slide summarizes the research that myself and colleagues did in collaboration with the Center for Urban Education and the Chancellor's Office to look at 113 colleges and what they included in their equity plan, right? So this was a discursive analysis of 1,853 activities. So across the 113 colleges, there were a total of 1,800 activities. And within that, campuses range between creating just 2 activities that were comprehensive, that were detailed, that were connected across academic and student services. And we also saw that range go all the way up to 100 activities in one individual plan, right? And you could think about reviewing and reading that plan. What does it look like to include 100 activities in your efforts, right? And what our research and what the work group has done over the last few months is thinking about and shifting away from this notion that we need to create activities, right? It's not about activities. It's not necessarily about one-off solutions or disconnected efforts, right? It's about thinking deeply about what matters on your campus for your students and what you could be doing to create collaboration and convergence across your institutional efforts, right? Hoping that we shift away from activities and thinking about new practices, new initiatives, or even existing ones, right, that are working to scale them up with the resources that you have that help us to identify, address, and hopefully eradicate the persistent and contemporary equity gaps that our students face. I think one of the big things, and this was a conversation I was having yesterday with the campus, is that we need to go beyond student services. When we looked at the data and across the 1,800 activities, about 65% of those were in student services, right? So that's a deep conversation to have on your own campus around what's the influence that we have in the classroom and the curriculum, and how do we build bridges with our faculty, with our Senate, with our governance councils to be able to think about how the equity plan and the process can actually move the work forward, not just in student services and onboarding and counseling, but also in the classroom where our students are primarily located, right? And then the last two efforts are, again, just about leveraging the existing work, honoring everything that you've done already, how you've built capacity to improve student success and student equity, and the way that this institutional plan for the next 3 years could be something that leverages all of that work, right? That brings in people from guided pathways, that brings in people from strong workforce, that brings in people from your dual enrollment efforts, and says, how do we create a comprehensive approach to this equity planning process that really creates a vision for equity over the next 3 years? And then the last thing that I'll share in terms of this slide is just thinking about the ways that we respond to systemic inequity in systemic ways. I know that this is a large mountain to climb, and that the racial equity work that you've been doing sometimes feel isolating and alone. I know that it can't be done on your own. So any way that we can use this 2.0 process, the research that I've conducted, or even, I'm excited that the CO is putting out bolder guidelines to support the planning process, as well as offering assistance through the office hours that Anthony will discuss later, is that knowing that you have a collective behind you and in front of you that will support you with your planning processes. And as I wrap up my remarks, I'll share a couple of tools that I've created in supporting 17 campuses to develop their equity plans for the next 3 years. And just a reminder about the intentionality we're trying to create in this new process with the template, with the data, and with the planning process that allows for you to really leverage this in ways that moves your campus in meaningful outcomes and experiences for racially minoritized students. So with that, we'll switch to the next slide that allows for you to kind of chime in about the work that you're doing already. As I mentioned, we want to honor existing efforts and collaborations and initiatives. And thank you for your time. And Anthony, I'll let you facilitate the slide.
Yes. So thank you, Dr. Felix. So please share race conscious equity efforts occurring at your college already. Thinking about that going forward, and also think about those conversations that you may need to have on your campus as we navigate through this tutorial. And so with that being said about the tutorial, I am going to be sharing my screen in relation to that. I just need confirmation in 1 second to make sure that, can I get confirmation from my panelists that we can see this? I'll make it larger as well. All right, we're good. Okay, so we've received an updated tutorial. So I wanted to just make sure that we all saw within the NOVA platform, your student equity plan sits with all the other student equity plans. And so we're going to get started with this tutorial. If I wanted to say anything about it, please consider everything that my previous colleagues have said as we move forward, especially in thinking about this process being intentional, race conscious, continuous improvement, and really trying to create those conversations on your campus. Here we go. So this is your brand new equity plan moving forward. I saw a representative from Allen Hancock here. This is not your plan. This is because your college is first on the alphabetical list. Please bear with us as we navigate through your college's equity plan. Just as an example, I want to make sure to make special note, this is a mock-up and this is not Allen Hancock's actual student equity plan. All right. So first and foremost, we want to make sure that you're aware of the data lake. We're going to be doing our best to provide both data on demand, which are going to be downloadable Excel spreadsheets, and the cohort view of the Student Success Metrics dashboard. We want to really provide special encouragement to make sure to use these links as you navigate through this plan, and that will be reflected in the guidance text as well. As you navigate through this plan, some key differences you'll probably see are in the metrics, and we'll go into those in a little bit more detail going forward. But I want you to focus first on these questions. We want to make sure that colleges are focusing on this process of being race conscious, and also think about the progression, right? The incremental progress in relation to what equity changes we want to make. So it's not about making immediate changes. It's about how do we build towards those changes and using this plan to be able to do that. So we're going to be providing some, along with the guidance text that we're trying to help with framing and that we're in the process of creating right now, we're also going to be providing documentation about race consciousness and about navigating through this process in a more direct and a more meaningful way in relation to the data that we have available as well. And with that being said, we also want you to think about your equity progression for 2022 to 2025. And this would be just more of a list, right? So that the first thing that you see when this is submitted is that these are your lists of your priorities. Thinking about the 2019 to 2022 plan and now transitioning into this one. And this particular question can be answered a little bit later, and you'll see why in a second, thinking about your executive summaries and going forward. So that's your landing page. We're going to have our assurances, make sure that you read Ed Code 7220 and kind of navigate through all that process. The key difference for context, your project lead for your previous student equity plan will be moved over. So that's one of the things that is going to be a key difference here. If you need to edit it, I believe you can do it yourself, but you can also work with us to have that changed. But the key difference here in terms of approvers and thinking about the conversations that we need to have on our campuses in relation to equity efforts, in relation to the guided pathways efforts that have occurred on our campuses, is having one of the approvers be your guided pathways coordinator or lead or lead. We wanted to make sure that colleges and representatives felt empowered to be able to bring the right people in that have been doing the good work on your campus into those conversations in regards to the approval process. And this is about cultivating that process as well. If you feel the need that in terms of thinking about approvers as well, what about also thinking about student engagement? Right? And how do we create those conversations? Having this guided pathways coordinator be there in that approval process is one step that we've wanted to take going forward. And so let's say you've completed all of those, you would go into next, and that will go straight into your equity plan reflection for 2019-2022. You will probably have seen this previously as the executive plan summary. For clarity, we really wanted colleges to focus on this being a reflection for 2019 to 2022, as this does fulfill the executive plan or the executive summary requirement for compliance. But we also wanted colleges to think about this process of reflecting, thinking about key initiatives, projects, and activities that supported equity efforts in this previous cycle, the evidence that colleges have of decreased disproportionate impact, thinking about that question from earlier about listing your equity plan efforts. This is where you have the space to be able to summarize them, right? And then also thinking about the pandemic. We've had the pandemic throughout this entire equity planning cycle. So thinking about how that's affected your equity progress, how it's affected some of the change, the processes, the thought partnerships that you've had on your campuses. Let's acknowledge that space and provide you with the opportunity to do that. And then thinking about expenditures as well, right? Estimated approximate spending for all of your expenditures in relation to student equity, not just student equity and achievement, but across your campus, right? In relation to salaries and everything else. And then from there, you would then estimate what percentage of the budget went to the activities that were associated with student equity and achievement, right? And that would be your entire executive summary, right? It's the reflection on your progress of 2019 to 2022. And these efforts and this money that you've spent should influence the process going forward in terms of what you want to do with your equity plan, right? And that goes into some of the major changes that we have made. One of the things that this data link that we've provided, that again is going to be available to you, is that we want you to be able to look at populations that are experiencing disproportionate impact and really think about how you're going to design in relation to that from your local college's perspective, right? Which population experiencing disproportionate impact are you going to be working on improving their circumstances at your college, right? And so what you can do here is you would add the population. And for this particular example, it is Asian students. It obviously is going may be different for your college. And so we wanted to acknowledge that. You also have the option of creating your own custom examples, right? So if your college has a unique population that is experiencing disproportionate impact that is not in relation to the populations that are required to report on by the Ed Code, then you can provide that as well. And so you would hit add, and that would show up here. But something that I want to make sure that we take special note of is that if you have one population here, completing all of these metrics for this one population completes the conditions for the workflow for your equity plan. So something we want to emphasize is that we would like you to work on one population for the initial completion of this equity plan. And then if you feel that there's other populations that require some more detailed planning, and you can go back, like let's say a year from now or maybe 6 months from now, and add those populations in as well, right? We really want you to focus on that single population going forward and do your best to answer in relation to all the metrics. You can also use populations to fill in the metrics that you don't have filled in. So if retention is not really a metric that is experiencing disproportionate impact for these particular student populations, you could add in another one. But really the idea is to emphasize the most disproportionate impact, right? And thinking about that process and what that means for your college. And so with that being said, that leads into our metrics. You can kind of see these metrics already: successful enrollment, completed transfer level math and English, which also, depending on your college, can include quantitative reasoning that is outside the traditional concept of math. Retention from first primary term to secondary term, moving away from fall to spring, and transfer and completion, right? Those are our main metrics fields, and we're going to explore those in the next section. So in relation to the metric fields, I will say first that all of these cards that you're going to be seeing are a rinse and repeat process for all of the other metrics. And so it's a pretty straightforward process for each one. It's just a matter of, for this particular student population and for this metric, these are what we're going to be doing, right? So thinking about vision for success goals in relation to Asian students regarding successful enrollment, these are the criteria that meet those efforts, right? And we also wanted to make sure that colleges were able to focus on structures that may be either impeding or stalling the progress of your population's experiencing disproportionate impact. So we wanted colleges to be able to have the time and energy and space to evaluate the structures that are in place: instruction, student services, business services, or other that you may list. What is the college's current process, policy, practice, or culture that impedes equitable outcomes for this population, right? Immediately after providing that, you would then say, what is the ideal structure, right? To really think about the idea of, we call it the pie in the sky, right? Like what would be the best practice, what would be the best thing that you could do for your students that would facilitate a shift to equitable outcomes for this population, right? From an instruction standpoint, student services, business services, or other, right? And you can have these either mirror these processes or not. But we would like to just see what you believe the idea would be for your college. Right? And then also thinking about planning and action, what steps could you do, thinking about from the perspectives of administrators, faculty, classified staff, partners that you have, and students. What action steps could get you from the current practice that's impeding this progress for your Asian students in successful enrollment and facilitate it towards the ideal, right? How can you get the right people involved? Right, in regards to this example. And then also thinking about funding, right? What budgets can we leverage to accomplish this process? That idea of braiding funds, right? What funding streams are available on our campus to be able to help facilitate this process further? And then also thinking about, well, what about system level help? from the chancellor's office, what additional resources would your college need, right? And this will help us in regards to thinking about how we can assist the system and your college really navigate through this process in a more optimized manner, but also in a more realistic and grounded manner, right? And how we can do our best with what tools that we can leverage to make your process of navigating through equity easier, right? And also providing an explanation space if you'd like to. And then finally, thinking about the process of outcomes. How will you know the planning and action process has been successful? What outcomes can you set for yourself based on what you've seen here, right? In terms of the 1 year, 2 years, or 3 years. And I want to note that these are customizable, right? In terms of what you would navigate through. So you can have 4 1-year outcomes, 3 1-year outcomes, right? Or a 1, 2, and 3 if you want to just do that. For this particular population, right? That's really important to note. It's for this particular population, these are the outcomes for this time frame, right? And then you can rinse and repeat that process as we move forward, right? So we want you to really focus on this one population, and then you would go back to your workflow and you would go and do this for all of the other metric fields, right? It's a rinse and repeat process. And so that's really the navigating through the majority of the plan. The next area that is essential is the process of survey. So we've provided a student support integration survey that is really thinking about how our college is going to also navigate through the process of creating some services on their campus that are going to, some are going to be mandatory, but also in terms of thinking about optimizing these processes for these student populations, right? Thinking about how your college's equity efforts align with guided pathways goals, accessibility goals, the process of improving financial aid, accessibility, and access, right? Just in general to this process of getting more students involved in FAFSA participation, Pell Grant participation, additional aid that you may have on your campus, basic needs centers, right? And so ideas of services, participation, and also navigating through the process of creating and maintaining a well-rounded food pantry, right? And then also other initiatives that we're working on from the systems level and trying to navigate through, right, at the college level. Zero textbook cost, LGBTQ plus support, and navigating through creating services for that population of students. And also student mental health, which is a huge deal, right? Especially navigating through all these processes of the pandemic and the fatigue of Zoom and all of these things. How do we create mental health related programs on our campus to be able to do that, right? And after you've completed all those things, these population metrics, right, and this survey, for one particular population, you can preview and submit. Something that I would like to note is that you can share this document. And one of the things that we wanted to make sure that was front and center were your target outcomes for 2022 to 2025. Right, really making sure that those are front and center for you, so that anybody that comes in and looks at this equity plan, as you have it as a PDF, they're going to be front and center there for you. Successful enrollment, completion of math, English, retention, right, et cetera, et cetera. Those will all be there for you, so be able to quickly reference, say how we're doing. And then you would also have these other metric areas, right? And then you would be able to submit your plan. Something I want to note that we really wanted to emphasize is that after you submit your plan, for this one particular population, one of the cool things that we can, in terms of like accountability and thinking about partnering with colleges moving forward, is that we would be, because certifying kind of like hard stops your progress, you kind of just work with the chancellor's office or C program. You contact us and be like, hey, Anthony, we'd like to add another population, and we just we decertify your plan, right? Like we usually do for other areas, and then you'd be able to add the populations in and just resubmit it, right? And so it's kind of that process of working together and trying to build a better bridge with the chancellor's office to be able to navigate through the equity plan as we move forward in this new cycle. And that's the plan, right? Really big emphasis on focusing on data, populations experiencing disproportionate impact, and also thinking about the future of your college and campus with these populations in mind. With that being said, that is the tutorial of the equity plan. In terms of what is next, we're going to be navigating through the data portion of that. And so I'm going to stop my share. If you have any questions in relation to that, we are available to you. We're going to be providing equity plan support navigating forward. And as a reminder, the student equity plan is going to be due November 30th. So we're going to have plenty of time to be able to navigate through this process together. And we hope to be able to work with you through this entire process. And so with that being said, I am going to give the floor to the WestEd team and Alexandra.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Anthony. And hello, everyone. Thank you for the opportunity to join today. My name is Alexandra Lozanoff, and I lead professional development for the Launch Board. I'm joined by my colleague, Karen Beltramo, who will be helping to answer questions. She's already begun in the Q&A. We're really happy to be here and have the chance to contribute to the new student equity planning. Okay. So today I'm going to share basic information about what you can expect to receive in terms of the student equity plan data. You can go to the next slide, please. Excellent. So as you can see here, today I'll be covering the who, the what, the when of the data, so to speak. I'm going to cover this information briefly, but please know that we'll have 2 additional webinars in March and in April to focus specifically on the data, along with other support and professional development throughout the spring. So today is truly just the beginning. So let's get started. All right, our first question will be who is managing the data? So next slide, please. Okay. So the WestEd Launch Board team is working hand in hand with the Chancellor's Office to provide accurate, action-oriented data. As we heard earlier, the data has been intentionally organized to align both the system-wide accountability and to the vision and intent of the new Student Equity Plan 2.0. Now, the student equity data is Launch Board data. It's specifically from the cohort view of the Student Success Metrics, or SSM, as we call it, dashboard. And this dashboard was developed specifically with equity planning in mind and also included feedback from the field. Our team at WestEd has been involved with this dashboard and the Launch Board as a whole since its inception. Beyond the work that we do daily to incorporate feedback, to improve dashboard definitions and metrics and provide professional development, for the case of student equity planning in particular, we're also constructing data files for each college. So for those files, and within those files, we're conducting the disproportionate impact analysis that's outlined by the Chancellor's Office. Now, while we're calling this Launch Board data, it's critical to stress that this data is coming from what the colleges have reported through their management information systems to the Chancellor's Office. The Chancellor's Office MIS unit then provides cuts of these data to the Launch Board in order to build the dashboard. So this is campus data. Okay, so now we're going to get really into the heart of our time here today, which is what data campuses will receive. So first, and you can go to the next slide. So colleges will receive data on 5 student outcome metrics that should hopefully be familiar. So student enrollment in the first year, completed transfer level math and English in the district in the first year, persisted from first primary term to subsequent primary term, attained the vision for success definition of completion within 3 years, and transferred to a 4-year institution within 3 years. Now, these metrics are the same as in the past, although they have been tweaked and improved over the past few years. Oh, for example, the data will include the percent of students who persist from their first primary term to their subsequent primary term. So that data will now include not only students who persist from fall to spring, as in the previous version of this metric, but also from spring to the next fall. So this will more precisely provide information about whether students are progressing in meaningful ways. If you'd like to learn more about these or other metrics, please join us for upcoming webinars later in the spring. We'll get into much more detail, including the cohort definition and the metric definitions. Okay, so next slide now. So one very important element about the data that colleges will receive is that it will be cohort data. So that means you'll learn about the outcomes of the specific group of students who enrolled in the system for the first time in a given year. So this graph that you see here shows the number of students in each cohort. Oh, as an example, there were 327,956 students who enrolled in a California community college for the first time in 2016-2017. So the student equity data will include the percent of that specific cohort of almost 328,000 students who transferred within 3 years. Now, of course, colleges won't receive information about all 328,000 students, but rather the transfer rate of the specific group of first-time students who enrolled in their college in 2016-2017. Okay. Next slide, please. Okay. So another important note about this data is that it is system-wide data. So what does that mean? This data has information that is not otherwise available to a single college. So, for example, the data set allows us to determine if a student is truly first time in the system, if a student completed transfer level math at one college in the district and transfer level English at another college in the district, or if a student really exited the entire California community college system before we would check to see if that student then transferred to a 4-year. All right, next slide, please. Now, this data is, of course, specifically for student equity planning, so it will be disaggregated by the many different identities listed here. These disaggregations are spelled out in the student equity and achievement legislation, with the exception of first generation, which has been added based on requests from the field. We'll also note that homeless is a new disaggregation this year and is data that has newly begun to be collected by colleges. I want to pause here and acknowledge that this is a very short and limited list that represents a near infinite number of combinations of identities and experiences. So the demographic groups and the language in the student equity data mirror the data elements used by the Chancellor's Office in the Launch Board. The data that we are working with here, as is the case for data aggregated for large, diverse populations, has limitations. Today, I will intentionally be using the language for various demographic groups that you will see in the data itself, with the recognition that that language may not resonate with all identities of those listening or of our students. As you've heard earlier in the presentation, this statewide equity plan data is really meant to be the start of equity planning. Colleges have access to data that further disaggregates demographic groups and may better align to the identities and language of your college communities and contexts. In the cases where colleges feel that these disaggregated groups and the statewide data do not adequately reflect their communities, they are welcome and encouraged to use their local data and have the opportunity to specify those specific groups in their NOVA plan, as you saw Anthony demonstrate earlier. We also want to highlight that these disaggregations will be available for all metrics except for successful enrollment. So as a reminder, successful enrollment measures the percent of students who enroll after completing an application in CCC Apply. So data on successful enrollment will only be disaggregated by race, ethnicity, and gender because that's the information that's available in CCC Apply. Okay, next slide, please. So for the other 4 metrics, the data will not only be disaggregated based on race, ethnicity, first generation status, veterans, etc., but the outcomes will also be further disaggregated by gender. So for example, as we can see in this graph here, there will be information on the percent of female veterans that complete transfer level math and English within their first year, and the percent of male veterans that do so. Okay. So those are the data disaggregations. Last and very, very important to note is that the campuses will receive data that flags which of these student groups are considered disproportionately impacted. So how will disproportionate impact be determined? Next slide, please. We're going to walk through the process step by step. In the student equity plan data, disproportionate impact will be calculated using what's called the percentage point gap -1 or PPG -1 methodology. So that simply means that we're comparing the outcomes of students in a specific subgroup to the outcomes of all other students. Okay. So as an example, let's say we want to identify whether Hispanic students are disproportionately impacted in regards to transfer. We will compare the percent of Hispanic students who transfer with the percent of all other students who transfer. The -1 in the PPG -1 methodology is highlighting that we're separating Hispanic students' transfer rate from all other students. That's an important step because in the instance where a subgroup makes up a large proportion of the overall population, we wouldn't want to compare their transfer rates to the overall rate of all students. In doing so, we'd largely be comparing Hispanic students or any other large student subgroup population to themselves and might not detect disproportionate impact. I've seen in the Q&A earlier in the Zoom function that this was an issue that has come up in the past. And so PPG -1 should be helpful to avoiding kind of that risk of not detecting disproportionate impact when it exists. So therefore, and that's why by comparing the transfer rate of Hispanic students with all or to all other students, we'll be better able to see where an equity gap exists. Okay, so that gets us through bullet point number 1 on the slide. The next step in the methodology is, let's say we've compared the transfer rates and we see that there is a gap. We will then compare that gap to a specific threshold. And if the gap is bigger, that group is considered to be disproportionately impacted. So continuing the example, let's say that 10% of Hispanic students transferred within 3 years and 15% of all other students did. That gives us, of course, a 5 percentage point gap. Well, if our threshold or margin of error is 2%, then Hispanic students would be considered disproportionately impacted. Now, on the other hand, if the gap between Hispanic students' transfer rate and other students or all other students' transfer rate is smaller than 2%, then the group would not be flagged as experiencing disproportionate impact. Now, there are statistical reasons for why a threshold is important, which we will not get into right now. What we want to emphasize is that the methodology is designed to understand where one has sufficient data available to be more confident that the gap exists, and thus helps us focus our attention. Colleges should examine and be responsive to any gaps, and colleges can absolutely act on equity gaps that are below that 2% or any DI threshold. And so that can include addressing equity gaps that aren't necessarily flagged as disproportionate impact in the equity planning process. All right. So that brings us to our third bullet here. So in the instances where disproportionate impact is flagged, the data will also include the number of additional students that would need to achieve the outcome to minimally close the gap to get within that threshold. So in our example, the data would include the number of additional Hispanic students that would need to transfer to reduce the gap so that it is smaller than 2%. In addition to that, the data will also include the number of students that would be needed to fully close the gap. That is to increase the percent of Hispanic students who transfer in 3 years to 15%, the same rate as all other students. We know this might feel complicated for those who are not familiar with these sorts of methodology. We will cover this in much greater depth in later webinars for folks who would like to learn more. Okay. All right. So let's now move on and discuss where will colleges access this data. So I'll have us move to the next slide, please. Okay, great. So colleges will receive 3 files through Data on Demand. These 3 files will include, first, there will be a 2022 Student Equity Plan data file that will have specifically the latest year of data available for each of the 5 metrics. And I'll explain what we mean by this in a moment. There will also be a historical file with data for all first-time cohorts since 2011, 2012. And in the historical data, you will not have completion or transfer outcomes for cohorts that started in recent years. And that's important to note because a full 3 years will just not have passed yet to be able to count the metric. The third file will be an instructions or a README first file to help explain the data. Please also know that we are here to support colleges and research offices in interpreting and understanding the data beyond this file. We want to also highlight that the data delivered through Data on Demand will include unFERPA suppressed data. Okay, so we'll go to next slide now. So I want to circle back to the Student Equity Plan file. This data file will focus on the most up-to-date information available for each of the metrics. What that means is that in this file, data will include outcomes of different cohorts of students. And that's because the persistence, completion, and transfer metrics involve measuring student outcomes over a longer period of time, which means that data will not be available for cohorts of students who first enrolled recently. So this chart here shows the data available for each cohort and highlights the data you will receive in the Student Equity Plan file. On the left-hand side, you see each of the metrics listed. The column list gives you the most recent cohorts. So the check marks indicate for which cohorts the data is available, and then the blue highlights the data that you will receive in the Student Equity Plan data file. So as you can see, the 2022 Student Equity Plan data file will provide the percent of students in the 2020 to 2021 cohort who successfully enrolled and completed transfer level math and English in the first year. On the other hand, the file will not tell us the percent of students in the 2020 to 2021 cohort who attain the vision goal definition of completion in 3 years, because these students, of course, have just started their educational journey and the 3 years specified in the metric hasn't passed yet. So instead, the Student Equity Plan data file will provide the most recent year of data that is available, which in the case of the completion metric is for the cohort of students who began in 2017-2018. Similarly, in the transfer rates in the file will be telling us the percent of 2016 to 2017 cohort students who transferred to a 4-year. And that's because transfer rates always require an additional year to report because we have to make sure that students have fully exited the system. Okay, I will note that the latest year of data will also be in the second historical file. The difference is that that file will include all the complete years of data from earlier cohorts as well, going as far back as the 2011 to 2012 cohort. All right, next slide, please. So while the Student Equity Plan data will be delivered through Data on Demand, colleges can get a preview of this data in the Student Success Metrics Cohort View dashboard. And as we heard earlier, that was really important to the committee in making sure that this data would be accessible. So the Student Success Metrics Cohort View dashboard is available publicly. And we really encourage you that you all interact with this dashboard. And we also want to remind you to proceed carefully because the dashboard won't have the critical information that you do need for your equity planning. So in particular, the unmasked data and calculations for disproportionate impact. That's because many of you know in the dashboard, we hide data when it pertains to fewer than 10 students to protect their privacy, which is why the unFERPA suppressed or that unmasked data will be coming to colleges through Data on Demand. Okay, next slide, please. Excellent. So this slide provides just a brief comparison of the Student Success Metrics Cohort View dashboard and what will be delivered through Data on Demand. So you can see here that the SSM Cohort View offers you information that is available to everyone and designed to be easy to use and have visualizations. Now, on the other hand, Data on Demand files will not have visualizations built in, but will include that unFERPA suppressed data and flag the student groups that are identified as being disproportionately impacted. Whew, okay, we've covered a lot. So our final question to answer together as a group is when will the data be available? So I'll have us go to next slide, please. Great. So the data will be available in March. So the data on the student success metric cohort view will be updated to include the most recent academic year. So that's the 2020 to 2021 data. And then unsuppressed data files, unpurpose suppressed data files with those disproportionate impact calculations will be available on Data on Demand for districts to download and distribute to colleges in the case of multi-district colleges. All right, that covers our 5 topics. That was a very brief overview to cover a lot of complex information. And so we wanted to note, next slide, please, that we will be hosting 2 upcoming webinars. So we will host a webinar to provide an overview of the student equity plan data, including an explanation of how the 5 metrics are defined and information on how disproportionate impact is identified. This webinar is specifically for people who will be applying the data to inform the action they will take on campus, people who will be not just writing, but also implementing the plans. And so we won't be getting into the details of the methodology or the calculations during this webinar. It'll stay at a higher level. The second webinar, however, will provide a deep dive into the data. So it'll get into a detailed review of the CSV files that will be distributed on Data on Demand. Webinar number 2 is really specifically for institutional researchers who will receive and work with the CSV files. And the webinar will be geared to those who are already comfortable with statistical concepts and calculating disproportionate impact with their own local data. And then each webinar will be followed up by office hours to provide more interactive support. So that covers my conversation or my information to share here. I will turn things, I think, back over to Anthony, who will take us and to our sort of final step. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Alexandra. Thank you for the West Ed team for your presentation. As we're on this webinar slide, I want to make sure to note specifically that we are working very hard to ensure that everybody has both webinar support, office hour support, and additional support through this entire process of navigating through the plan. And so we're trying to work on having office hours and additional support webinars through, until November, right? When the equity plan is due. The student equity plan is going to be due last day of November. So I just want to make sure that we're all on the same page for that, and to be aware that we have additional supports planned for you, and we will be doing our best to navigate you all through this process and work together to build this equity plan. Next slide, please. Actually, 2 slides, so 1 and then 1 more. And so thinking about everything that we've discussed today, really thinking about this process is in relation to the student equity plan. This is kind of like your screenshot slide if you need to share with your colleagues this idea of the key ideas that this presentation: intentional design, being data driven, thinking about the metrics that support guided pathways in the vision for success, accessibility and standardization, and also colleges and their ability to identify student populations experiencing disproportionate impact. And also thinking about using that process of disproportionate impact identification to support planning, student-centered design, and also thinking about the efforts in a way that uplifts our populations experiencing disproportionate impact, because as we uplift those students, we also uplift all of our students, right? And so thinking about the way in which we design around that. And so please, as we continue forward into our question and Q&A session, think about these processes as kind of a shorthanded idea of what we're working for building towards the long term. Next slide. And so with that being said, I would like to introduce Michael Tran to facilitate our question and answer session.
All right, good morning, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us. I think at one point our participation, our attendee capped off somewhere around 205 people. Wow, thank you so much to all of y'all for joining us today. And my assumption is you all are busy and we're not here to waste your time. You want that information. So we'll ask a few questions to our panelists today, who I will like to recognize. That will include Dr. Laura Brady, our very own Guided Pathways Regional Coordinator, Leslie Bonds, Board President. That will also include Alexandra from West Ed, and our main man, Anthony Amboy from the Chancellor's Office. So thank you to all of our panelists for joining us today. And again, I want to give you all a shout out as well for helping provide this information, providing clarification, and being willing to provide even more information that is forthcoming for all of our colleges. So thank you all so much. And before we get started, if you haven't already had a chance, more information, more support, more resources will be available. And we'll share all of this through the C program listserv. So if you haven't already been added, please contact us. We'll put the email below for you to contact us first to add you, because that is the main way that we'll communicate the updates, information, and share the resources. So we'll put that in the chat for y'all in just a little bit. But there was a great question that was asked earlier, and thank you, Leslie, for answering it already. But we wanted to also give our panelists a chance to answer it because, you know, maybe to elaborate a little further if necessary. And I have one question for you too, Alexandra, because I promised to ask you last time, but we didn't get a chance to. So I'm gonna come right back to you. This may pertain more to Leslie and Laura. One question that was asked earlier, and I'm just gonna read it right off top. Previously, colleges have relied on C program to fund positions. What strategies would you all recommend to free up resources to make the systemic changes that are needed, especially going forward and knowing that the student equity plan is that opportunity, right, to put these plans down and to try to execute going forward. So I would like to throw it out to y'all. Anthony, if you want to hop in, all good too, but I would like to throw it out to Laura and Leslie to field that one first.
Sure.
Laura, you want to take it first? Perfect.
I'll take it quick, but I'm going to refer back to the response that you provided in the chat that I thought was really comprehensive and was a great response to that question. The only thing that I would have to add, Michael, to that question is the opportunity to leverage and highlight student voice, especially taking advantage of the additional one-time funds that are going to be rolling in this year for colleges, thinking about making this an opportunity for colleges to really think about how are current efforts having an impact on student achievement, and asking students specifically, you know, there are amazing efforts happening here in the San Francisco Bay Area where colleges are doing hackathons and doing a different number of approaches to involve student voice and increasing accountability for themselves. So that's the only thing that I'll have to add, but I'll refer to Leslie for her response.
Yeah, I appreciate that. I think that's a really good and important point. And you all can see that it looks like I put 4 different points there in the Q&A, but I want to just acknowledge that this question itself really gets at the heart of the shift from SEP 1.0 to 2.0, right? That we're starting to ask questions about, you know, when we first got all of these funds coming in, I remember being on a campus, and it's a lot to get this new pot of funding that has some kind of unclear directives and at the time really stringent requirements, and it was hard to spin that down. And so I know that my last budget when I was an equity director was 80 to 85% tied up in salaries. There wasn't a whole lot that we were going to be able to shift around to try new things. And so it's a great opportunity as we're kind of at this tipping point with iteration 2.0 to go back and say, when we started this work, when we started spending down equity funds, were we as intentional as we wanted to be? Were we as race conscious as we wanted to be? With the information we now know, would we do it the same way? And take it as an opportunity to fix it, to reform it, or to throw it out and try something new, because that is the space that we're in as a system. And it's kind of the, you know, just a really great opportunity to start that conversation. So I put a couple of prompts in the Q&A, some questions to start asking yourself, but really that's the heart of interrogating your own practices to say, does this really set us up for what we intend to happen? And if not, then to try something new. So that's what I'll add there if you want to check out the full Q&A there. And we will be putting a Q&A out with the template when we disseminate it. So we'll be sure to include some of these types of things there.
Additionally, I'd like to add something that we're trying to work on from the Chancellor's Office perspective is really trying to figure out how we can make connections from like our northernmost college to our southernmost college. So creating the space from what we're trying to do right now is try to create spaces for colleges to be able to share what they're doing that's successful. And one of the things that we're also doing is trying to figure out the best way to bridge those connections. And we've done that through regional coordinators in terms of thinking about how colleges could also contact us directly to ask questions like, hey, we're having trouble with navigating examples related to this. If we receive enough inquiry, we can create like webinars or office hours related to that to really kind of find the colleges that can have these conversations with each other. And that's like our job in navigating through this as well. Just if your college feels like it needs further assistance in relation to kind of some of the things that I discussed when we were doing the tutorial, right? If you need help with that process, that's what we're here for, right? It's not just about the process of, oh, you have this due in November. It's more about like, we have this due in November, but I want to do everything I can to help you get there. And so if that involves us working with colleges to be able to help them figure out ways to braid funding better, or to find colleges that are exemplify that process, that's why we're here. So, and we want to keep emphasizing that process.
Right on. Thank you, folks. I really appreciate it. And maybe this might sound a little naive to add, right? But I would also really encourage, like, there's going to be a lot of tough conversations. There's going to be a lot of heavy lifting. But, you know, as someone who's friends with a lot of mixologists out there, maybe I would like to also suggest too, maybe throwing in a splash of creativity as well. I know that may sound really simplistic, but this will require a reimagining. This may require thinking in new directions, maybe partnering, and because we really want to de-silo all of these efforts, right? So who has not traditionally been involved in conversations regarding equity can be pulled in, can be collaborated with? Can it involve more student input? Could it involve maybe even community-based organizations that may work with your colleges as well? How can bringing them into this planning process maybe helps illuminate potential blind spots that that everyone may have? So that's just me, a little 2 cents. But, and then going on off of that, since I am also new here, there was something that was brought up that was touched upon earlier that I really appreciate the person's courage. And Alex, this is a question for you, and that you don't have a whole lot of time, but we do want to hear from you. But for someone who may be new to this whole process, someone maybe working with this much data, working with recency and maybe comparing that with unitary data, all of that stuff, right? Just balancing all of that. What are some questions that maybe they should have maybe at the front of their mind to start going through all of it, right? Not necessarily, I mean, yes, which group experiences the most disproportionate impact is the first one, but what are other questions for someone who may be new to start off while they're looking at all the data that you all will be sharing with them?
Oh, not an easy question, Mike. I appreciate that though. Yeah, there's so much. So I think, let me see if I can, there's so much to think about when looking at data, and it can be so overwhelming, whether it's looking at the dashboards and graphs, whether it's sort of getting and looking at Excel files or getting report outs from IR folks. It can always feel really overwhelming. I always like to sort of think about 3 questions that are how I think about data is sort of, what is the problem, or what is a problem that I want to be solving? Why is it happening? And what can we do to bring change? And I think that really aligns to kind of what we're seeing in this approach and in the NOVA plan as well. And so when looking at the data, sort of asking, what am I seeing here that sits wrong? What am I seeing here that concerns me? And it can be really easy to sort of say, well, and think about why the data might be wrong or what the limitations might be. But instead of that, sort of saying, how is this different than I think the world should be? Really narrowing in on that problem, and then looking at sort of, and for whom is that especially true? And that's where looking at this disaggregated data is so important. And then really thinking about, why is this happening? And I think that's one of the reasons why to having these metrics that really mirror student journey is so important. So we this data will provide insights into different points on a student's pathway. And so to look at the data and really think about, what does this data show us about where some of the biggest barriers are? And then when we start to think about where those barriers are, then of course it's about asking how can we bring change? And I will circle back to Dr. Laura Brady's comments around student voice. I think there's no better way to answer how we can bring change than in partnership with students. And that can include having and inviting students to reflect on data and what they're seeing and asking them to share and if how their experiences are reflected in the data and vice versa. And then of course, to get into some of that creativity that you mentioned, Mike, and have students really engage with us in how we can think about how to address that. So that was a big answer to a big question, but I hope that helps a little bit.
Hey, that's great. No, we really appreciate that, Alex. And the thing is this, right? There's more information coming. There's way more support coming, folks. So we appreciate you hanging in there. Again, if you haven't been added to the C program listserv, please feel free to contact us and we'll get you added because that's how we will announce all the information being available, where to find it, all of that. So I know we're running up on time, so I want to thank all of our panelists. On top of that, there are some people who aren't on camera. We also want to thank that have been helping with the chat, and also who aren't here that have also been helping with shaping this new iteration of the Student Equity Plan. There's a lot of folks out there, so you will get your props soon. Don't worry, folks. We'll give you your shine soon. But due to just us being limited on time today, I just want to thank everybody for joining us today. I want to thank all the panelists, all the folks that have created everything. And definitely shout out to all of you for doing the heavy lifting out there. Let's be real. We know y'all know the solutions, and we just want to give you a place to put it down and show us how you're going to plan your work and work your plan, as they say. So I'm going to hand it back over to our MC, Anthony Amboy, to take it over. Thank you, everybody.
Yes, and with that being said, this is our final slide. Just some key dates and information, and also a final ask for everybody. Please take a moment to provide us some feedback with the survey that we have listed in the chat, especially if you shouldn't have attended all 3 webinars, but if you did, please, your input is highly valued. Please please take the survey. As a reminder, this webinar is a series of 3 of the same that provide information. So we were asking you to fulfill a survey. The Student Equity Plan itself will be available in Nova by the end of March. This month, next month. Gosh, February is going so fast. We're going to be providing a communication packet, which means a template, guidance, and a sample plan. It's going to be available in early March. And we're going to have, again, monthly office hours from April to November to assist you in this process of navigating through the equity plan. We are doing everything we can. If you have any questions, please contact us. I believe MT has listed the emails various times throughout this webinar. Please, we are here to help you navigate through this process just as much as we are to assist in the facilitation of this process. So please ask away. We're here for you. We're going to be working with the field as best we can. We're going to have as many supports as possible navigating through this. And as a final note, thank you so much to all the panelists. Thank the team, the conferences and events team for navigating through this process with us. And thank all of you for taking time out of your schedule to navigate through the Student Equity Plan with us, its updates and the changes that are coming. And thank you once again for attending our webinar. We appreciate you being here. Have a wonderful day. We wish you the best. Please stay safe and healthy as we navigate through this pandemic together. And we will see you at our office hours if you have any questions. Thank you so much.